Thank you, everyone. It's good to be here. I've really enjoyed my time in Wisconsin. Everybody's been so nice, and I've enjoyed it, and they put up with my accent. You know, when I was at Ohio State, I was in a class of two. There was me from rural Arkansas. The other guy was Dr. Jitten Master, who was an Indian with an English accent. He was born in North Africa, raised in London, England, and came over to the program. One night, Jit and his wife, who was also Indian, my wife and I, we go out to eat dinner. The waitress comes up, she takes Jit's order, she takes Jit's wife's order, she takes my wife's order, and then I order. After I ordered, she looked at me and she said, "You're not from here, are you?" No, I'm not. I'm sorry, I can't hide it. My suggestion would be try to take out about every other syllable, and I'm thinking what I'm saying might make a little bit of sense, okay? Okay, well, thank you for being here. Thank you much. Let's go back in time to a period of history that spans the 14th to the 17th centuries. This was the Renaissance, a cultural movement that saw a reconnection in the areas of art, literature, politics, science, and religion. There was a resurgence of learning based on these classical learning sources. Someone who symbolized the spirit of the period was known as a Renaissance man. These men were well educated and had expertise in many fields. Two of the most recognizable Renaissance men were Italians Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. Michelangelo was a painter, sculptor, architect, engineer, and poet. His best-known works were the sculptures Pieta and David, along with painting the creation of Adam and the rest of the Sistine Chapel ceiling. This project took 4 years. Obviously, he got paid by the hour. You know, that's the way you look at it. Da Vinci was even more diversified, having expertise in many areas. However, he's mainly known as a painter, with his best works known being Mona Lisa and The Last Supper. Have you ever looked at Mona Lisa and noticed how much she looks like Da Vinci? It's amazing. Also known for his famous drawing Vitruvian Man, which is a drawing with man's ideal proportions according to the ancient Roman architect Vitruvius. You see the writing above and below the drawing. Those are the proportions that Vitruvius proposed. You can see right here it says, from the top of the head, or from the chin to the top of the head is 1/8 the height of man. Just a lot of these proportions. Actually, it doesn't say it there. It says it somewhere in there. I really can't read this, but somewhere in there it says that. That's a bunch of the proportions that he listed. It's a classic blend of art and science. Da Vinci was ahead of his time. He conceptualized a helicopter, a tank, solar power, and a calculator. You know, we think we're high tech. This guy lived from 1452 to 1519. You see, prior to the Renaissance was the Middle Ages, a time of political and cultural decline. The Renaissance was a rebirth, a reawakening, a time of reconnecting and advancing knowledge. Let's fast forward to today. Since 2008, a lot of offices haven't advanced that much. The economy has taken its toll. You know, when you've got Tom scheduled at 10 and Bob's at 1 and the rest of your day is wide open, that hurts. But it happens, even to some of the most established practices. That's why we developed the Removable Renaissance, to reconnect to some classic dentistry, get back to basics, and advance our practice. Why removable, you ask? Well, let me tell you. The time is right. There are 78 million baby boomers in our country today, according to the U.S. Census. A baby boomer is someone who was born between 1946 and 1964. How many boomers do we have in here today? Quite a few. Quite a few. Think about it. The boomers first hit standard retirement age of 65 last year. So there's a lot out there, and it's going to continue for the next few years. As a matter of fact, The 65 and over crowd, there's 37.9 million in our country today. By 2015, the 50-plus crowd will comprise 45% of our population, nearly one half. Now, speaking of one half, the consumers that are baby boomers, they are responsible for one half of all consumer spending. They buy 77% of the prescription drugs, 61% of the over-the-counter drugs, and they spend 80% of the leisure travel dollars. That's where the money is. Now let's dig a little deeper. This 65 and over crowd, 27% are edentulous. So that's 1 in 4 of that nearly 38 million that we talked about a while ago. We're talking 9.5 million edentulous people, 65 and over, in our country. We haven't even talked about those below 65. So this, my friends, is where we're going. You may be here to pick up a few tidbits about dentures, or maybe you've recently graduated and a review would be nice, or maybe you're an assistant who would just like to learn a little bit more about the denture process. Either way, we've got some simple concepts to drive your practice growth. One of our Renaissance men, Leonardo da Vinci, stated that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And if that's the case, I hope by the time we're finished today, you say, hey, that was a pretty sophisticated presentation. Because I like to keep it simple. Y'all, I'm just a good old country boy from Arkansas. I don't like to make things any more complex than they need to be. So let's just eliminate the clutter, get down to basics, and see what we can come up with. My outline today, we'll look at the denture process. I've divided it into 3 parts: before, during, and after. Before, we're going to look at evaluating the patient, examining the patient, and then educating the patient. I like to tap into some of the wisdom of Mark Twain, who said the secret of getting started is breaking your complex, overwhelming task into small, manageable tasks and then starting on the first one. Now notice, this is not a multitasking deal. Start on the first one, focus on that, and then move from there. Let's look at this evaluation. Gang, I'm going to tell you, this might be the most important thing I say all day, because the denture evaluation is key. You're going to find out a lot about your patient, a lot about whether you should even be doing the case just from talking to them. As a matter of fact, M.M. Devan stated that the dentist should meet the mind of the patient before he meets the mouth of the patient. Well, you think about it, that's pretty true, especially with dentures. Especially with dentures. This is Dr. Ernest Svensson. He was my denture mentor up at Ohio State. Dr. Svensson and I were discussing dentures one day, and I said, Doc, what's the most important thing you do in a denture case? He said, I'll tell you what it is. The most important thing you do is assess the psychological condition of the patient. It's not your impression, it's not your bite, it's looking at what they've got in between the ears. That's why I learned, okay, I want to check in between the ears before I start checking what's in between the cheeks. It's a good place to start. While I was up at Ohio State, Dr. Larry Peterson was head of oral surgery. He had a 0 to 100 scale, which, as you see here, 100% of the chewing efficiency you get with natural dentition here. 0 is no teeth. In Arkansas, we're saying we're just gumming it. I don't know if anybody's ever said that. But you see, as we increase the number of implants and get closer to natural dentition, we are decreasing the reliance on tissue support. So we're in a better situation. But the fact of the matter is, when we get down to it, none of us in here can probably do better than around 20 to 25% chewing efficiency with our dentures compared to natural dentition. You know, we'd like to think we're better, but we don't have any roots. We're not holding this thing in. So that's about the best we can do. Because if you think about it, when you're assessing this psychological condition of the patient, one of the key things is, what are their expectations? Because when you're looking at this scale, if they're expecting to be about here and they're paying for this, if those two lines don't intersect, we've got a problem. So that's what we need to assess. Now, I've got to admit, when I first put this together, I had Tom Brady on the screen. Then I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to Green Bay. I got to get Brady off there. But now think about this. Think about this. Let's say you have a patient that comes in and he's lost his arm. You make him a prosthetic arm. Now, is he going to expect to be able to throw like Aaron Rodgers? No, not at all. If you have a patient that loses a leg and you make him a prosthetic leg, does he expect to run like Olympic champion Usain Bolt? No. Well, then why is it when they lose their teeth they expect to chew like any of us who have a full complement of teeth? It's not realistic, but that's their expectations. So we need to make sure we get these expectations in line. I remember one guy told me once, he said, you know, dentures are not a substitute for teeth, but a substitute for no teeth. Think about that. Not a substitute for teeth, but a substitute for no teeth. That makes some sense. If we can get this across to them, we're going to be in pretty good shape because those expectations will start to line up. Why is the patient here? You got to assess that. Why is the patient here? That's going to tell you whether they're going to get used to wearing a removable prosthesis or not. What's one of the first things you learn in prosthodontics in dental school? We've got fixed and we've got removable. What's our first course of action? We go fixed if we can, don't we? That's the first thing I learned. Of course, this was well before implants, but try to go fixed if you can. If you can't, look at the removable option. Well, why is that? Because patients are going to prefer that. I remember a few years ago, this lady who I'd known her all my life, her son and I grew up together. She comes into the office. She's got 2 lower molars missing. Name was Bonnie. I said, Bonnie, what can I do for you? She said, well, I need a lower partial. What's going on? Got 2 molars missing. Okay, how long have they been missing? About 25 years. I look in her mouth. Occlusal plane's perfect. Nothing disrupted at all. You have any trouble eating? No. You know, Bonnie, why are you here? Well, my husband told me I should come down and get a partial. Have you ever worn a partial before? No. Well, Bonnie, do you want a partial? Well, I don't know. My husband told me to come down. I mean, y'all, I've got to live with this thing. I've known her all my life. Her son and I are friends. I said, look, Bonnie, when you want the partial, come back and see me. Do you think she ever came back? No, she functioned just fine. And I wasn't going to take her money for nothing. I mean, you know, I just didn't feel comfortable with that. So keep that in mind. Why are they here? Why are they here? Back in the 50s, Dr. M.M. House popularized a classification system that a lot of you heard in dental school to kind of give you an idea as to what patients are going to work well and what aren't. He had 4 classifications. The first is the philosophical. These patients are rational, calm, and cooperative. They have the best mental attitude of all the denture patients. They desire their dentures because they want to look good and they want to maintain their health. These patients adjust real well and they have an excellent prognosis. Secondly is the exacting patient. These patients are methodical, accurate, precise. They remind me of my old patients who were engineers. You know, boy, engineers are always just so precise in everything. You know, that canine's about 1/10 of a millimeter too tall. You know, they would really get you because they make severe demands at times. A lot of times their appointments go a little bit longer than normal because they want everything explained in very great detail. These patients have many dental failures, dissatisfactions, due to how picky they are. But you know, if you can please them, well, they will jump on your man wagon and be one of your best supporters. The hysterical patient. These patients are generally poorly adjusted and in poor health. They sit around and think about how bad things are. They have a negative attitude and usually will seek their dental treatment as a last resort. They have many past dental failures that follow these unrealistic expectations. The hysterical patient has a poor prognosis. And then we have our indifferent patient. These patients just don't care. They don't care what they look like. This is the guy that'll go for years without a denture. You've seen them. You know, these guys don't adjust very well at all. So they've got an unfavorable or questionable prognosis. But you know, the interesting thing I find about this classification system is the fact that House is talking about denture prognosis, and we haven't looked in the mouth yet. We've talked about the psychological aspects, and that's it. That tells you a little something right there about the denture patient. But you know, it'd be nice if we could go into our interview and say, well, are you philosophical? Are you exacting? Are you hysterical? Are you indifferent? We can't do that. But you know, on the other hand, as we go through these questioning, we can get an idea as to how they can function and adapt. Of course, adapting is the key. And y'all, some people are better than others. Some people adapt quicker, adapt easier. There are a lot of factors involved in adapting. Let me introduce you to my two grandmothers. The one on the right in this picture is 102. This one's 97. You know how hard it was to make this picture? I mean, you know, you try to make pictures of little kids. This was just the same thing. I mean, I was trying to get them to both look at me at the same time. This one's looking, this one's not. It was just like, come on, Grandma. You know, look, here, up here, You know, as we age, we don't adapt as well, as quickly. I mean, I can tell you right now, I wouldn't want to do a denture on either one of these girls. Age is a big factor. But the fact is, as the baby boomers age, what are they doing? They're getting into dentures a little bit later than when they did when a lot of you guys were starting practice, you know, and so forth. So things are changing. As a matter of fact, when we're in our 40s, you think about it, the tissues heal pretty quickly. They're pretty resilient. Patients are still pretty interested in aesthetics, and they tend to adapt pretty quickly still. What's the problem with the 40s? Well, they continue to go till we get to the 50s. Unfortunately, things start to change a little bit. Tissues don't heal as rapidly. They're not as resilient. The patient's ability to adapt starts to decline. Not that they can't, because obviously that's going to vary from patient to patient. But there's a lot of things going on here. But the fact of the matter is, no matter what age group we're dealing with, the better health the patient's in, the better prosthetic risks they are. One of the worst things that we can have happen is have the patient just be sick, sit at home all day, and think about how bad things are. That's not the denture patient you want right there. Of course, so we have to do a psychological prognosis with our patient. When you think about it, if the patient has had a previous denture experience that was positive, they're satisfied, there's a good chance that you can satisfy them. If they're dissatisfied with their existing denture, but that followed a period of satisfaction, there's a good chance that you can satisfy them. If they've never been satisfied with their dentures, oh, not too good, guys, not too good. So where do we start? We've got to start with the chief complaint. What are you here for? What do you need? What do you want? And follow that up with their previous denture experience. Find out what those expectations are. I'm going to tell you that one of the worst things I wanted to hear in dentures was, well, I've had this denture for 30 years. Wow, not a good situation there. Because generally you think back, what about that patient is the same today as it was 30 years ago? Their denture. It's worn. That's about it. That's about it. But you're going to take those dentures out, take a look. Look at the extensions, look at the wear patterns, look at the occlusion. See what they've been doing. The problem is sometimes they're going to bring in this bag of dentures that didn't fit right or were never made right. You've seen them. Now, let me ask you, what do you think the chances are that one of those dentures has probably been made correctly? One of them probably has. Now, if one of those was made right and the patient couldn't wear it, what do you think your chances are of making a denture correctly and the patient can't wear it? Pretty high. Pretty high. Probably not going to satisfy them. But that's why we go through this evaluation process. Because we want to question them. We want to find out what's going on in between the ears. Because y'all, there's some red flags that should pop up. And I got to be the first to tell you, I've missed it. I've missed it. I'll never forget the patient that came in. I'd gotten back from Ohio State. I was married, had 2 kids, needed to work, would do anything that came in. Patient comes in, she says, I need a new upper denture. Okay, I'll make you a new upper denture. So as we got to talking, she said, now I got to tell you something. I said, my last denture was made in Arizona and I had to end up setting the teeth for the dentist. Okay, don't worry, I set my own teeth, I can do it, no problem. That should have been a big red flag popping up. Okay, so I do the setup. At that time, once again, I did almost all my denture work. And y'all, I'm going to tell you, about 1 out of 20 times would I feel like I really nailed it. I set it up, followed the lower lip, looked pretty in her mouth. Occlusion was right on. I thought, wow, this is something. I was proud of it. So I checked everything out, checked out with me. I was going to show it to her. Gave her the mirror. She looks at it. Oh my gosh, this doesn't look very good, does it? What? What's the problem? Y'all, after we finished, she had 4 central incisors. Her laterals, she couldn't get them big enough. So I ended up putting 4 centrals in. Put enough exostosis in to do 3 facelifts. I mean, this looked like an alien denture. So I finished the case out. Delivery day comes. And go through all the checks, adjust the occlusion, adjust it, put it in. And she looks at it and she says, oh my gosh, this looks terrible. I said, I know, you know, I agree. It does look terrible. And at that point in time, I thought, you know, I've had enough of this. Let's just go our separate ways, and we did. You know, you think about it, I put a lot of time and effort into that for no money, you know. So the fact is, that should have been a red flag that popped up. Why, when she says, I had to set the teeth for the dentist in Arizona, did I think that I could be really any better? You know, what I should have done is what I call take the Barney Fife approach. I should have nipped it in the bud. Nip it, nip it, nip it. I'd have been better off not to ever do the case. You know, learn from my mistakes, gang. Learn from my mistakes. Okay, that's the evaluation. Now we need to get into the exam. I'm not going to talk much about the radiographic side of things. We're just going to kind of look clinically. What I want to focus in on are 3 aspects of the exam that we need to look at. The retention, support, and stability that we can get from this patient. For our definitions today, I'm going to define retention as resistance from movement in an occlusal direction. Obviously, when we're talking about retention, you're generally talking about an upper denture. Support is resistance to movement in a tissue direction. So in other words, if I'm building on this concrete floor, we've got good support there. If I'm building and this is all sand up here, that's not such a good foundation and so forth. But you know, that's what people present to us in our denture cases. And then stability is resistance to movement in a lateral direction. So as you're examining the mouth, think of these 3 concepts. Okay, let's take a look at the maxillary arch. From a retention standpoint, the key thing in the maxillary arch is what? Developing a seal. Not too hard to do on most cases. The thing is, we just need to make sure we get into the vestibule. We get around our frenum, back up all the way around, covering as much as we can, sealing everything off. Now, the key thing is make sure you look in there. You can have a single frenum, you can have a double frenum. These attachments are going to be okay. Sometimes that attachment is closer to the crest of the ridge. That can be a problem. That can cause the seal to break. Now, as we progress through the posterior buccal vestibule, we come through the hamular notch, through the palate, and we seal off in that way. That's the key to retention. Can we get that? In most cases, you can. Here's the problem, and let me orient you. This is the posterior buccal vestibule, hamular notch as we're going into the palate. Now, y'all, I worked for 10 years in a dental lab. And the most common problem with denture impressions, where most of them were missed, right there. More specifically, the posterior third of your denture impressions is where most upper denture impressions are missed. As a matter of fact, that's the same on the lower. Posterior third, that's where most of the problems are. So make sure that you get back in here. Usually what I find is that this area ends up short. And of course, if it ends up short, what does that do to your seal? It just breaks it a lot easier. Now we've got to consider support. Once again, resistance in a tissue-ward direction. The key thing here is your primary bearing area, which are your posterior ridges and the flat portion of the palate. Now, what we would like here, obviously, is to have nice, attached, firm tissue. You get in, check that with your finger, and you can see this tissue's bound down, nice and firm, not any flabbiness to it. We're in good shape here. But take a look at this, and you see this all the time in the anterior maxilla. Notice how spongy that looks. And you know, that always seemed to give me a problem as far as getting as good retention when you've got support that's poor like this. You know, you look at the ridge and you think, well, this is probably okay, but then you start fiddling around with it and you see, my gosh, I can move the whole ridge with my finger. That's generally a bad sign. You know, we don't like that. Now, of course, from a stability standpoint, what helps in a lateral direction? It's having some height to the ridge. Having some height to the ridge. So you can see by having decent height all the way around, that will help in our side-to-side direction. And I think another key is down here in the hamular notch area. Coming off of the tuberosity and going up into the hamular notch. Another key in stability. Of course, the other thing you have to look at are also undercuts and so forth, but that's a clinical judgment. But those are the three things that we look at in that maxillary arch. What do we have for retention? Do we have enough that we can get this and get a good seal? But you know what you'll find out is if you've got good support and good stability in your maxillary arch, it's amazing how much better your retention is. So they all kind of work together. Now the problem is that most patients have a mandibular arch also. And that's where the denture issues come in. Because you think about it, how many of you, and be honest, how many of you get really good retention, really good suction with that lower denture? You know, it seems like I remember once in 20 years maybe having one that just seemed like it had a little when I took it out. I mean, 1 in 20 years, I don't bank on that happening very often, you know. Because you think about it, there's nothing down there. I mean, I guess we could do a tonguectomy, you know, and cover the floor of the mouth and it might work, but most patients are not going to opt for that. So the key things here, you think, well, we don't have a lot of retention, so what are we going to rely on? Support and stability. Now, when it comes to support, the primary bearing area is the buccal shelf. The reason for that is the buccinator muscle comes down here and attaches, and because of that muscular stimulation, you're not going to end up with very much resorption in that area at all, if any. So that's our primary support. And of course, your secondary support is your ridge. And you see here we've got nice, attached, bound down tissue. We're in good shape there. We're in good shape. From a stability standpoint, the key thing, once again, just having enough height to resist the side-to-side movement, which we do in this case. We can work with that. Retention, well, the key thing there is just make sure you've got it fully extended, you've got it cut out for your frenum. Just get what you can. Just get what you can. Now, what do we have in our favor here? Nothing. You know, really. What are we going to get from a retention standpoint? Probably not much. What do we have from a support standpoint? Well, we've got a little rim of mandibular tissue down here that's unattached. You know, this might be one of those patients you can grab that lower lip and pull it and just watch the ridge move back and forth. You know, that's generally a bad sign. Now, what have we got for stability? There's no height to that ridge to speak of. So we've got a lot of stuff working against us. Now, when you see something like this, all's not lost, though. Always look back here in the distal lingual. What you want to do is make sure that you get that denture very well extended back in that area, because I'm going to tell you that is all you've got to hold on to. Some patients can tolerate it, some can't. But if they can, use what you've got there. Use what you've got. So when you look at that mandibular arch, we've got nice case here. Once again, you just saw this picture. Bound down tissue. Nice ridge here. Attached tissue. Good to work with. This is the problem situation, obviously, because if you think about it, what we've got here is a jawbone. We've got unattached tissue that moves, and we've got a hard denture. So we've got two hard pieces with something soft that moves in between. It's amazing it even works. But it does. But it does in most folks. And then, of course, sometimes you have these real thin parallel ridges. Always concerned about those because it seems like patients tend to have more of a tendency for sore spots with something like that. Now, one of the last things I want you to do on your exam is make sure you check the patient for a retracted tongue. The reason for that is if they've got a retracted tongue, they can't wear a lower denture. They need to start thinking implants and thinking them real soon. So what I want you to do is tell the patient to act like you've got a bowl of ice cream. get you a spoon and take that ice cream to the mouth. So have them do that a few times. See what happens with their tongue. The tongue should stay forward. As you see, this tongue's going back. So what happens as the tongue goes back, we get real crowded in the back of the mouth, kicks the denture up. The patient can't function with it. Best thing we can do here is at least a couple of implants. You know, I'll tell the patients, they have a retracted tongue. You can't wear a lower denture. You're going to have lots of problems. But by keeping that tongue forward, I mean, they've got a chance. Because think about it. In a case like this, with all this resorption, what holds the lower denture in? Gravity is a big factor, right. Now, as far as what the patient has, it's their tongue and their cheek muscle control. Those three factors, gravity, tongue, cheek muscles. That's it. But the thing is, what I want you to do is when you're doing that exam, think of the big picture. Think of the big picture. Realize this is what I've got to work with. This is what I've got to build on. This is where we're going. Okay, so we've been through our evaluation. We've done our examination. Now it's time to educate the patient. The problem is what you've done. You've talked to them and you've examined them. Do your patient responses always equal your clinical observations? I would say no. You know, how many of you have had patients that come in and say, well sure, doc, I brush, I floss every day. They've got plaque everywhere and gingival margins that are red as can be. Yeah, you know, their nose is starting to grow. Yeah, that just, no, this doesn't always equal. So that's why we're putting all this information together. But what I like to do is get with the patient and say, look, this is what you have in your favor. Talk about the positive aspects of the case. And this is what you've got working against you. Inform them of the negative aspects of the case. You know, when I was younger, I was always scared to talk about what was negative. I'm just a positive person. But the more dentures I did, the more I realized I've got to talk about the negative. You know, let them know. Because y'all, these are not my problems, I finally came to realize. If a patient doesn't have a lower ridge, that's not my fault. That's the patient's problem. And they've got to take ownership. You know, you can do the best job you can do, but still it's that lower ridge that they don't have. Of course, you know, you might have somebody, you might have to consider something like a soft free line. Maybe that's an option. But what we're doing, once again, is looking at our evaluation, putting that together with our examination, and in your mind coming up with what we think our chance of success is. That's where we're going. Okay, I introduced you to my grandma. Let me introduce you to my dad. I always laugh about the fact that, you know how some people, you know, you hear about them stealing to support a drug habit. My dad practices dentistry to support a horse habit. You know? Oh gosh, you talking about a money pit. You know? I was talking to my sister. I didn't get the horse gene. I'm kind of the black sheep of the family. And talking to my sister the other day, and I said, well, how many horses does he have? Well, he's probably got about 75, 76 right now. I'm thinking, how do you have time to ride all those? You don't. So he looks at them. You know? But if that's what makes him happy looking at horses, he can do it. But you know, when I first got into dentistry, Daddy pulled me aside and he said, I want to tell you something. When it comes to this dentistry, here's something I want you to always remember. He said, always explain it on the front end so it doesn't seem like you're making excuses on the back end. And I thought, hey, Daddy, thanks. That's some pretty good advice. Because I'm going to tell you, if you don't tell them about the problems on the front end, they're going to say, well, you know, you're just kind of trying to cover your tracks here. Just trying to cover your tracks. Now, this is my hometown, Danville, Arkansas. That's where I grew up. This is Yell County, Arkansas. Has anybody ever heard of Yell County, Arkansas? Somebody probably has. You ever watched True Grit? Remember Maddie Ross, who was from Dardanelle in Yell County? So yeah, that was the initial setting of that movie. But I've got a good friend who practices up in Dardanelle. And when I was putting this together, I called him up and I said, hey, you do a truckload of dentures, and he does. His practice is heavy into removable. And I asked him, I said, what makes it work? What makes it work? He said, I'll tell you what it is. He said, I spend a lot of time talking to the patient before we do anything. I inform them of everything. We're on the same page when we start. Okay. Okay, well that's pretty cool. Now look at this. How many of you in here are going to jump in and remove these wisdom teeth? I'm not. I don't want to touch it. This is one that's going to my friendly neighborhood oral surgeon, real quick. I don't have time to mess with that, and I don't want to wake this one up. So you think about it. We've got a situation here that we don't want to deal with because it's something we don't feel comfortable with. Okay, well, we're trying to look at our potential for success. How many of you ever referred out a root canal? Anybody? Sure. You bet I have. Many. Didn't want to mess with them. Wasn't worth my time. Okay. Well, is it important that you do every denture case that walks in? My point being, y'all, when you've done this examination, when you've done this evaluation, if the chances of success are not there, why deal with it? Once again, learn from my mistakes. If those red flags are popping up everywhere, don't do the case. Don't do the case. You're not going to do the wisdom teeth. You're not going to do the root canals. You're going to refer out the screaming kids. Get the stuff that's not going to be successful out of your practice. There's somebody else, there's a prosthodontist or somebody who should be willing to put up with those headaches. Let them do it. Of course, at the end, we got to talk money. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you what to charge. I just think you ought to charge enough. Okay. Reminds me of a buddy of mine. He and I were talking one day, and he was telling me about a denture patient that came in. And he said, this guy, I knew him, and I knew he was going to be trouble. I said, well, what did you do? He said, after I'd gone through everything, I went back to my office, and I sat down, and I started thinking. And he said, I came up with a number. And I said, I'm going to charge him this much. And by charging him this much, I'll smile every time he comes in. So, okay. So what did you expect? He said, I didn't expect him to do the case. He said, it was a lot of money. Okay, so what'd you do? He said, I went in, told him about his whole situation, then I quoted him the fee. He said, I said, what did he do? He said, he accepted it. I said, really? I said, what did you do then? He said, I smiled every time he came in. So if that's what it takes for you to put your fee at a point that you'll smile every time it comes in, if you're going to do a case and you realize that the patient's a little on the hysterical side or the exacting that's going to take more time, if someone builds a 1,000 square foot house, are they going to charge the same as when they're building a 4,000 square foot house? I don't think so. So if you're anticipating more time, well, realize, hey, I might need to charge a little more. So that's the 3 E's of before. Let's get into during. This is going to be the actual process of the denture. Legendary basketball coach John Wooden once said, develop a love for details. They usually accompany success. That's pretty neat. You see, what Wooden would do is when he got his team together before practice would start, they'd all sit down and he would get a sock out and show them how he wanted them to put on their socks. That's interesting. He'd say, I want you to roll it over the ball of the foot, up through the arch, over the heel, pull it up snugly. Then run your fingers over to make sure there's not any wrinkles. Now, why was Wooden concerned about wrinkles? Because they can cause blisters. What do blisters do to performance? You can't run and jump as well with a blister. Not only that, when the players came in, he would measure their foot. Because as they're growing up, Mom always bought them shoes that they could grow into. So if they said they wore a 14, more than likely he was going to put them in a 13 because that was their actual shoe size. Why did he not want the excess room? Didn't want the feet wiggling in there. Why is that? Because that could cause a blister. What does the blister do? Hampers performance. Okay. Now Wooden says, some people think I'm a little crazy for being such a stickler on these details. But when you think about it, you realize that over a 12-year period, he won 10 national championships, 7 in a row. you start thinking, well, you know, maybe this attention to detail, maybe there's something to it. Because if you think about it, when it comes down to any prosthodontic process, what's the most important step? Well, in my mind, it's the step you're on. Because if you don't do step 1 correctly, is step 2 going to be that good? If step 2 is not right, is step 3 going to work? So I think it's this attention to detail that's the key. And it's not that a lot of this stuff is that difficult. I heard Dr. Greg Foles speak the other day, and he mentioned the fact that he said, a lot of times I just like to make sure I'm doing a common thing uncommonly well. Okay, that makes sense. Well, let's look at during. First thing is the impressions. Now, when I was in dental school, we were taught a 5-appointment sequence. Primary impressions, final impressions, record appointment, wax try-in, delivery. Pretty standard for all y'all? I mean, that's pretty much what we're taught and so forth. You know, the interesting thing about what we're taught is that Gauthier did a survey a few years ago, 1992, and what he was doing, he was surveying 530 dentists who had graduated from a dental school over a 15-year period. And what he found was that really they only did about 1/2 of the denture procedures that were deemed to be academically essential. Okay, well, I mean, you know, how many of you are still border molding your dentures? Okay, you know, were you not taught to border mold with compound in a custom tray like I was? Do you not hate compound in a custom tray like I do? You know, yeah, sure. You know, how many of you are using a face bow for your dentures? Yeah. You know, it's just not happening that often. If you do, fantastic. And if you use compound with a custom tray, fantastic. But most people get away from that. And it's interesting, in this study, the further we get away from dental school, the less we do with our dentures. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, I'm just telling you what's going on. So, you know, for some of you, if you're having issues with your denture impressions, I want you to pay attention to this next section. If your denture impressions are coming out fine and you're having a lot of success, I'm not trying to change your mind. When I was in the lab, I used to have people call up and they'd say, hey, I'm thinking about switching my crowning bridge impression material. Okay, what are you thinking about? Well, this, or this. Okay, what are you using now? This. What kind of problems are you having? None. You're not having any remakes? No. Margin's great, contact's great? Yeah, very little adjusting. Why do you want to switch? Well, I don't know. Don't switch. You know, I'm not trying to talk you into switching here, but if you're having issues, you know, think about something like this. Anybody using the AccuDent system? Okay, how do you like it? Been using it for a few years? 15, 20 years. Yeah, it's not like it's new. How many of you made alginate impressions before? You know, everybody has, of course. That's the neat thing about this, because this is just an alginate system. And the fact of the matter is that it's not something that has a big learning curve. Now, how long have you used the AccuDent?
3 years.
3 years? Okay. Worked pretty well? Good. I mean, it is a nice system. It comes in a System 1 and System 2. This is mainly for partials. Is that what you use for immediates, the System 2? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. And then System 1 is more for complete dentures. Now, if you notice, there's twice as many lower trays as upper trays. Just keep that in mind as we go through this. This is the setup. Now, no new concepts here. You've got a tray gel and a syringe gel. So it's kind of borrowing from our crowning bridge ideas. Here's the key, this big old syringe right there. And of course you get a little thermometer and all this other stuff that's really cool. So let's look at our maxillary impressions. The first thing you want to do is select a tray that's about 3 millimeters larger than the denture on each side. Once again, this is an alginate, so we kind of have an oversized tray. This is the syringe gel, kind of the orange color. Doesn't require a lot of water, just mix that up and backload it into the syringe. Okay? Now, when you're doing this, do you mix the syringe and the assistant mix something, or does the assistant mix it all? Okay, how are you doing it? Okay, sure. And what you've got here is this is the AccuGel, requires a little more water. Now when you're mixing this, it kind of appears a little dry right at first. Don't be tempted to add a little bit more water. Keep mixing that up until it becomes a creamy consistency here. Now load this from the back, making sure once again that we get through the retentive holes with our material. And what you want to do is have it loaded for the maxillary more in the anterior. Once that's loaded, do a little wash. That's going to do two things. It's going to help pick up better detail and help the bonding of the two materials. Go in, clean the mouth out, and start with this back in the hamular notch area. Come to the midline, then go to the other hamular notch and back to the midline. Okay? Then come, inject a little in the palate. I mean, boy, if there's one thing I'm talented at, it's getting a void in the palate. I can do it with the best of them. So by injecting this up here, we're eliminating that possibility. But here's the neat thing about this, is that notice how that material just doesn't run all over the place. I mean, it pretty much stays put. Go in, seat the tray in the anterior, roll it to the posterior till you see a little bit of material expressed out the back, and stop right there. Grab the filter, do a little pinch and pull. Always, always, no matter what material you're using, have the patient yawn. Really big. Come back and do a little massage on the cheeks. Don't spend a lot of time doing it, and then you're set. Pretty much like you're doing it, Joe? Okay. When you remove it, the key thing they say is do not remove it by the handle. Just break it loose in the distal buccal like we do all our denture impressions anyway. Then we come out, rinse, disinfect, put it in the holder. Now the key thing here, and I think the guys from the lab would back me up on this, y'all pour these alginates up as soon as you can. It's amazing how at times at the labs we will get alginate impressions wrapped in a paper towel, you know, that have been sitting in a car for an hour. You know, chances of accuracy going way down. You know, not going to happen. Pour those rascals as soon as you can. As soon as you can. Now here's the impression. Notice the detail that's picked up here. Pretty nice. Here's the big point though. Once again, remember, from the 10 years of me being in the lab, most impressions are missed right here. But we're injecting back in this area. Boy, it's hard to miss it when you're injecting back there. So if you're having difficulties getting this properly extended, that syringe can go a long way in getting the job done. So you get a cast that, granted, is not border molded per se, but Joe, when you do this, do you have many overextended margins or dentures and so forth in the maxilla? I mean,
one thing I do is I always use the alginate adhesive because
okay.
otherwise when I first started doing it, I didn't notice it separate every once.
Might separate just a bit. Okay.
So by using adhesive,
that hasn't been an issue. Okay. Okay. What about, are you having many overextensions and so forth with your maxillary dentures? I mean, it's pretty well right on, isn't it? I mean, it's a nice system. Now, there's a little bit of a twist with the mandibular impressions. First off, you have to look and see what kind of ridge you have. As you see, this is a pretty well-developed ridge right here. And that's going to be a low distal rise tray. Remember I said we've got two sets of trays here. Half of them are for low distal rise, which you see this just kind of has a gentle slope here. And the other half would be for someone who has a lot more resorption. You can see more of a vertical line here. So that's your high distal rise tray. So you select that, but here's one of the keys in this system. Notice how low this goes on the lingual. So you select which tray you need. You get some calipers, put it in the first molar area. This will give you the width of the tray. Take this back. Obviously this upper left, the tray's too small. Upper right, tray's too big. This is the tray you want because it's matching up with the holes here. And that's the width of your denture. Now the thing is, once again, we're doing an alginate, so we need about 3 to 5 millimeters of space. So we've got to have some room in here. But think about this. Think about this. When you've got these cases where you've got the lower ridge that's basically non-existent, and it seems like the floor of the mouth just goes over the ridge, that's a tough situation right there. Always had trouble with those things. But once again, that's the advantage of this system and how low this goes on the lingual, because it's pushing all that sublingual gland out of the way and getting you a good impression of this mylohyoid region. I want to tell you, even today, if I'm doing a border molded impression, I'm still going to use this for my primary impressions, because I want to tell you, you're not going to get a better lower to make a custom tray off of. Always have the patient stick their tongue up on the top of the tray just to rest. Just like the upper, we go in, we wipe it out. Now on this one, we're going to start back at the retromolar pad, come over to the anterior. A little bit different. Remember, in the upper, we put most of the material in the front. On the lower, we're going to put it in the back, because once again, we're trying to push all that material out of the way. Wash it just like we did. Seat it, roll it back. Once again, don't remove it by the handle. Just break it loose in the distal buccal. There's your impression. There's your cast. Now, remember a while ago when I showed you the case that we decided there wasn't much in our favor on that case? Look at this. This is a very good impression of this distal lingual area. In a situation like this, where that is all you have to hold on to, that's a good way to get back there. Now, once you do this, realize whereas, I asked the two people up here, with the upper, it's pretty well right on. With the lower, obviously, we're making an overextended impression. That's the whole idea. Now, once this impression's made, it's up to the guys here at the lab to recognize the landmarks that will be used for the extension of your denture. And they can do that. They've been reading these casts for years. So that's how you determine the extension of your lower denture. How have your lowers been? Do you have many overextensions from doing this? It's a little bit more than with the upper, wouldn't it be?
And burnouts on that distal lingual are hard to avoid.
Hard to avoid, sure they are. But you're going to find that with just about anything, you bet. Okay, that's the Accudent system. So we've got our impressions made. This was appointment number 1. We've got our impressions made. Now let's get a pupillometer and an allometer and take a couple of measurements for the lab. This is our pupillometer. This is an allometer or a facial meter right here. The pupillometer has a little projection on the back that, as you can guess, sits right on the incisive papilla. So what you want to do is have the patient sitting up straight, stick this in the mouth, and get a lip measurement as to how long you want your maxillary rim. Okay? I mean, it just takes a second. Gives the lab some valuable information. The allometer, you want to measure the width of the nose. Now what does that do? Take a look at this young lady. If the lab's having to select the teeth for you, look how the width of the nose falls just about at the middle of the canines. So that gives the lab some valuable information on what size of tooth to use. Now that also points, as you can see here, to this medium-sized tooth. And the lab knows. How many of you select your own denture teeth? A couple, yeah, and that's usually what I find. There's usually a couple. Most people are letting the lab do it. It works either way. But this will tell you, I need a medium-sized tooth for this measurement, okay? So we've got our cast, we've got our pupillometer, and our allometer measurement. Okay, let's get into the records. When the lab gets the case, here's what they're going to do with it. They've got the cast, they're going to put a reference mark up here. They've got the pupillometer, they'll put that up on the cast just like you had it in the mouth. Get a Bowley gauge, measure down to wherever you want this. They can transfer that mark to the cast, and they're developing that incisal edge that you said you wanted. You see, what we're trying to do here is just get you a maxillary rim that's going to require little or no adjustment. I mean, I think we're all for not adjusting stuff. Don't you love it when a crown comes back and you just throw it in the mouth and it fits? No adjustment, everything's on. Well, that's just what we're trying to do here in removable. Now, if you measure the width of your allometer here and give that measurement, then they'll know where the corner of the canine is going to be, because that's going to be where the mouth starts to turn back and we develop our buccal corridor. So the lab can also use that to contour the rim, once again, to get you the rim you need. Now, of course, the key thing is if the patient's happy with their existing denture, by all means, make an impression of that. Send it in. Of course, they can try to, you can't always get the same tooth. Sometimes they're not available, but for the most part, we can get pretty close. And also, they can use that to check the width of the rim and the contour and so forth to see that we're getting you back to where you need to be. Now, here's the thing. With these wax rim contours, there's two issues with the wax rims. First off, the upper rim we're going to use to establish our aesthetics. The lower rim is going to work on our vertical dimension. And there are anatomic, phonetic, and aesthetic issues with each rim. So what we've got from an anatomic standpoint, we want to look at the nasolabial fold, the mentolabial fold, the philtrum, and the commissures. Because if it's not supported properly, what you're going to have is a deepened nasolabial fold, a flattened philtrum, commissures that droop, and a deepened mentolabial fold. The patients need all that support. So as you're looking at this, one thing I like to do is get to the side of the patient. When I'm looking at how much lip support we want to give, a lot of times if you'll get close to 90 degrees right here, that's going to get you in the ballpark. That's a good place to start. Take a look at this lady. Obviously, no denture here, nowhere close to 90 degrees. A little closer right here, we've got a much more acceptable situation. Anybody use a Fox plane? I try to use a Fox plane all the time. I mean, it just helps me considerably. And what were we taught with the Fox plane? Well, let's make this parallel to the interpupillary line. Okay, now let me ask you this. What happens when Marty Feldman comes in? For those of you who remember who Marty Feldman is, he had one eye a lot higher than the other. Makes it kind of tough, doesn't it? Well, you know, I heard Terry Tanaka talk about this one time, and I thought, wow, this makes a lot of sense. Because he said, you know, we've all been taught to use the interpupillary line. He said, but the fact of the matter is when we're looking at people, if that occlusal plane or that incisal plane is parallel to the floor, that makes a lot of sense. That looks kind of natural. And in this particular patient, this eye was higher than this eye. She kind of sloped up this way. This is parallel to the floor. Doesn't look like it in this picture, but it is. That's what we need to do. I'm not saying don't use the interpupillary line, but I'm saying if you don't have the good interpupillary line to work with, just kind of work with the floor. Of course, we can also use that to develop the posterior portion of our plane paralleling Camper's line right here. Boy, I tell you, one time I had a patient come in and she had, I mean, this was her incisal plane. Biggest slope I've ever seen. And I was going to be super dentist. I was going to save that incisal plane. I was going to straighten her out, which I did. And it looked pretty. And it worked well. Until she got home and her husband saw her. He had never seen her with an incisal plane that was straight across. And he thought, oh my gosh, you look wrong. You know? So if you're thinking about making these changes, make sure you get the spouse in or somebody who's significant. Because you know what I ended up doing with that? Redoing it. You know? Because he hated it. But we did it. We made her crooked and everybody was happy. I mean, let's go with it. Of course, the thing is we also need to mark the midline. One little key is you can look at Cupid's bow here. Just make sure you have the same amount of teeth on the right side that you have on the left. Have the patient smile. Do a high lip line, especially if you don't have a cast of an old denture to go by, because this will help the lab establish how long a tooth, because we don't want a lot of acrylic showing here. We want mostly tooth. The fact of the matter is, when you've done this, sometimes your line might not add up with the frenum that's cut out. Don't worry, trust your line. And the fact is, if it's wrong, we're in wax, we can just heat it up and change it. No big deal. But trust what you see. Don't trust the frenum. Now, let's say, you know, you've got somebody, and the men generally don't care, but sometimes these women just want more and more support. A quick way to check that, just warm you up a little base plate wax, cut a strip off, put it over, just tack it on. Put that in the mouth, let them look at it, see if that support looks good. If it does, seal it down. If it doesn't, peel it off. Sometimes if your occlusal plane's off a little bit, warm up a bigger piece of wax, just cut out the outline, and then change it as you need to. You can add a millimeter pretty quickly that way. If you can only add half. You know, I had one lady once, and I swear, I kid you not, she kept wanting me to open her up, open her up, open her up. We opened her up 9 millimeters compared to her old denture. I was shaking in my boots the whole time. I mean, she wanted it, she functioned with it, she did great. Didn't have any wrinkles, you know, as you can imagine, but she had enough freeway space and it worked. I would have never thought it. Now, from a phonetic check, of course, one of the key things we do, the wet-dry line. And we want to make sure that that upper rim, when it comes down and the patient is going through the sibilants, that it touches the wet-dry line. It provides a seal there. Of course, the best thing to do in my mind is just 55. 55. See where that rim touches that lower lip as the patient goes through the F sounds. You can also use V. Now take a look at this young lady. This young lady's in her 20s. Notice how much of her central incisor is showing here. You know, we're probably talking 2 or 3 millimeters. Okay, here's one of the things from an aesthetic standpoint. When you're dealing with a younger patient, they're going to show more central than a middle-aged will, and a middle-aged is going to show more of their central than an elderly patient. Now also, there's a difference between male and female. A female patient is going to show more of their central than a male. In general, females have a shorter upper lip than males. So keep those two things in mind. Younger shows more central than old. Female shows more central than male. Now, that might be a key concept when you're getting to the lab that papillometer reading. You might not want to go to the length of the lip. You might want to go 2 or 3 millimeters beyond to have your rim there just to check. But those are the things that we do to get the information we need. Okay, let's look at the mandibular rim. The key thing here, the anatomic concerns, your premolar and canine area should be just about right at the commissures, right at the corner of the mouth. We want to go about halfway up the retromolar pad. And take a look at this from a lip support standpoint. This young lady, ectodermal dysplasia. No, I think she's only got a couple of molars in the back. Look at how deep this mentolabial groove is, and we've also got a groove here. Now, after a few years of surgery and getting a few things done, notice how opening the vertical and getting some teeth provides better support. So those are the things we're trying to eliminate, these deep, deep grooves here. Of course, from a phonetic standpoint, going back to Earl Pound and so forth, the S sound is the key. The S sound is the key for this vertical dimension in this lower rim. Of course, also keep in mind that as we age, things go south. If you talk to me, you see a lot of upper teeth. You talk to my dad, you'll see a lot of lower teeth. So the older the patient, a middle-aged patient, a lot of times the rim will be just about right at the level of the lip. As we age, the rim might actually be a little higher. Okay, now we've gone through the rims, but let's talk a little bit about vertical dimension of occlusion. Let's take a look at this lady. What's one of the problems with not enough vertical? You know, you can see that pretty easy, can't you? I mean, what we're talking about here is the distance from the nose to the chin. And you see, this is what we're working with as dentists. Of course, unfortunately on me, this third keeps expanding. But, you know, we've got to break this down, but this is what we're concerned with. What we want to do is get the proper distance from here to here. So what we've got is really a pretty simple formula. It's the vertical dimension of rest minus your interocclusal distance gives you your vertical dimension of occlusion. Now, the neat thing here is we know one of these. I mean, for instance, interocclusal distance, let's just put that at 3 millimeters. When I was in dental school, I was taught that it was 2 to 5. Ivoclar has some materials, they put it out as 4. 3 is going to get you in the neighborhood. So you've got that. So you establish your vertical dimension of rest, subtract 3, you've got just about where you need to be. So the key thing here is we want to put a dot on the nose and one on the chin. Now look at this situation. This is me, and the sibilant you use for your vertical dimension of rest is an M sound. Emma, Emma. And just kind of say that, Emma, and let your lips touch, Emma. Once your lips just barely touch, are your teeth touching? No, they shouldn't be. Emma. Now, that gap between your teeth, that's your interocclusal distance, your freeway space, okay? As you close all the way down into occlusion, that's your vertical dimension right there. Now, there's some calipers provided by Ivoclar. These vertical calipers allow you to measure that distance from the nose to the chin. You know, a lot of times we'll get these rims back. There'll be contacts in the posterior portion, open in the front. What you want to do is adjust that until you're hitting pretty even, and then compare what I've got here. This is the patient's existing denture. This is the wax rims. Now you can't see the measurement, but I've got it at the same place. Don't trust the existing denture completely. Don't trust that completely. What you want to do is get to there, but then check it to make sure it's correct. Don't assume that. Go back and have the patient get to the vertical dimension of rest, and that's what I've done here. Emma, Emma, with the lips just barely touching. At that point, I have the patient hold still. Hopefully they can. And I separate the lips and look to see what I have. Once again, we're looking at vertical dimension of rest. There should be about 3 millimeters of space here. Once again, that's your interocclusal distance. The distance from the patient's nose to their chin at this point, once again, is the vertical dimension of rest. And when the patient closes all the way down and these wax rims touch, that's our vertical dimension of occlusion. So how do we check that? Once again, the S sound. Mississippi, 66. A lot of times I'll have the patient count from 1 to 10 kind of quickly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Because in some of these cases where we're opening the vertical a little bit, they might touch initially. But once they get used to that, you'll see that they can adapt. Some patients do, so check it more than once. Of course, let's get back to our lady that has the dentures on your right side and not on the left. The problem is, when we've got this kind of distance from the nose to the chin, what's going on with our interocclusal distance? We've got way too much, way too much. So what does that lead to? Well, the number one thing is pretty bad aesthetics, okay? And then, of course, some angular cheilitis and problems here, maybe even some temporomandibular joint problems. Now, let's talk about the flip side of that. What if the patient only has 1 millimeter of interocclusal distance? Wow, that's a different story right there. So what happens there? Well, when the patient's talking, those dentures cling together. And a lot of times they'll end up with soreness on their ridges. So that's what we need to do to make sure that we get this properly opened, but obviously not too far. Now, once we've done that, in this case, and I'm sorry I didn't even tell you about that. This was a patient that worked at the lab, and she had these teeth. She had dentures since the 70s, and I told her, I said, I need some pictures of a case. Let me make you a denture. And she said, okay. She said, but don't do anything to these teeth. I want to keep them just like they are. So I didn't know that black teeth were in, but you know, she wanted to keep those. So that's why I didn't. Normally I would have put a coping or something on there, but she's had them in there since the 70s and she's doing fine, so she wanted to keep it. So just disregard that. But what you see here, we've got the vertical dimension established. We've got our anterior stop here. I've removed a little material in the posterior and put 2 non-parallel notches on each side. So we go in and we make our bite. The thing you want to do is always make sure you support that lower rim. We don't want that thing bouncing around or moving any during our bite registration. So as we're doing that, you know, a lot of people have a lot of different ways that they do it. I usually have the patient stick their tongue up and as far back in their throat as they can and just close till they first feel a touch. Some people have them kind of go out and in, kind of like they've got an intraoral tracer, just front and back, and then close till you first feel a touch. Just whatever works for you, do that. Just make sure that you support that lower rim. So we've got our bite made, material set. And then I like to tell the patient it's time to deliver the denture baby. So we get this out. What you want to do is turn it around and check and make sure that we're not hitting on either one of these sides. Because if that area over the retromolar pad comes up and hits that tuberosity area, that can kick that rim just a little bit. That can throw your bite off. So make sure that we got plenty of clearance on each side, which we do here, and then separate, make sure that our notches are going to orient this just right. So we're in good shape there. We've got everything done. At that point in time, it's time to make a shade, take a shade. Now, you know, I remember years ago, do you remember when A2 used to be a pretty light shade? You know, it's not that way anymore, is it? So I'm going to tell you, if you don't have a bleach shade guide, get one. You're going to need it with your veneers, you're going to need it with your crown and bridge, and I'm telling you, I was talking to Ken here at the lab, and he said, well, about 10% of the dentures we're doing, we're using bleached denture teeth. I'm going to tell you, I think that number is going to continue to rise. So you're going to need a shade guide even for your denture teeth here pretty soon. So if you don't have one, get one. So what we've got the case mounted, and we're ready to set some teeth. We're ready to send it to the lab. We've got our rims contoured. The upper rim was contoured for our aesthetics. We use the lower rim to get the vertical. We've got a mounting on the case now. So it's time to look at our tooth arrangement. Of course, think about it. When we're talking about arranging the teeth, we arrange the anterior teeth for aesthetics, the posterior teeth mainly for function. The key thing with our teeth is we really can't set teeth like they are sometimes in the mouth. We can't have a whole lot of vertical overlap, because if you think about it, as this lower incisor slides out, we've got a large vertical component which introduces a lot of horizontal forces. Now, let me ask you this. Where in dentistry are horizontal forces good? Think about it. Are they good in dentures? No. Remember, one of the first things I learned in perio was trauma from occlusion in the destruction with our horizontal forces. When we talk implants, one of the first things I learned about implants is let's try to get the forces along the long axis of the implants, get rid of the horizontal forces. So that's what we're talking about. What you want to do is have an incisal angle that is as low as possible, okay? Millimeter vertical, millimeter horizontal overlap would be pretty ideal. The lower, the better. Because what we're trying to do here, if we can, we've got an occlusal plane, and boy, we would sure like for that to be fairly well parallel to our lower ridge. And why is that? Because that's going to make things more stable. Make things more stable. You think about it, as these forces come down and hit the occlusal plane, and the forces come and they're perpendicular to our ridge, we've got a more stable situation. Because if the forces come down and there's an angle, what does that angle introduce? Horizontal forces. What do horizontal forces do? Kick the denture loose. Now, let me show you this. This is an old implant case, but I think it illustrates a good point. What we've got here, this case was in about 18 years. This is part of the bar that's left. It used to be a full arch bar. You can see the destruction. It never did fit right on this side, and eventually the patient lost all the implants over here, and obviously a lot of the bone also. Now I'm going to tell you, y'all, the more difficult cases you get into, where we don't have much ridge and stuff, the closer I get to a flat plane occlusion. Because you think about it, if you got a flat plane occlusion, what's going on with your horizontal forces? We're decreasing them, okay? We're decreasing them. Now, look at this. Of course, you can see a lot of destruction from all the problems we've had in the past, but in general, that's the plane of our ridge right there. The problem is, as we go back, you see that this is basically a junction where we start heading up to the retromolar pad. Okay, so there's the junction right there. Now, you mark that on your cast and you see that that comes to about the distal of your first molar. Okay? Now let me ask you this. What happens, let's imagine this is a denture situation. What happens when the patient bites down on something right here? It comes down, those forces come down and hit this incline, don't they? What does that do to your denture? Kicks it forward. Not a stable situation. Now, I'm not trying to shortchange patients, but that throws the idea out, do we need to put all the teeth in there? No, not in every case. So you can see what we actually ended up doing here was leaving the second molars off, because the first molars went all the way back to the point we needed it. You know, you might play with this. Some people, you know, in some cases you might need to leave the first premolars off, put a couple of molars back there. It doesn't matter. The one thing I would suggest is that whatever you leave off on one side, leave off on the other side, because the patient will sure pull it out and look at it, and if it doesn't seem somewhat symmetrical, they're going to question you about it. But don't think that you have to use all the teeth. So I went to one of our local skate parks and I wanted to illustrate this point. First, I went out to Walmart and got a nice green little ball. So I'm standing up there and I'm going to bounce that ball and it's going to come off the platform and straight back up to me. Now let's imagine this is our occlusal plane and this is the ridge. So we've got a situation where when I bounce that ball, it goes down and straight back up. To be honest with you, that ball didn't bounce that straight. It's not made with great tolerances, but for our purposes, let's imagine that it was made well, okay? So that's what we've got. Now, I'm going to move over just a little bit. Now, I'm going to bounce the ball this time, and look what happens. Doesn't come back up to me, does it? So there is our occlusal plane. There's our ridge. So as I throw that ball down, it bounces to the side. Once again, we're kicking the denture forward. Now, what's the main problem with that? Well, I tell you, crazy ball rolled down the hill and I had to chase it, you know. That was the issue. But when you're talking dentures, the fact is, it's not a stable situation. So try to make sure that we direct those forces perpendicular to our ridge. Okay, so let's look at finishing the case. Now, I've included our wax try-in with finishing due to the fact that if you don't have a keen eye on your wax try-in and the finishing aspects, you know, you're missing it. But what's a wax try-in? It's a preview. This is one of the great things we can do in dentistry. We get to preview where we're going. We put it in, let the patient look at it. If things aren't what we need, we can change it. We can put 4 centrals in if we need to, you know. We've got those options. The key thing here with the wax try-in is what you've got is the case on an articulator. And you want to make sure that on the articulator, that case looks just like it does in the mouth. Pretty simple, pretty simple. Now, the problem is sometimes patient's going to close down and they might be hitting on this side and this side's wide open. Now, the way you want to check that is when you have the patient close, don't just say close and sit there and watch them. Kind of guide them or see where that first point of contact is. Because if it's on this side and this is open, you know what the patient will do if you don't guide them or watch them is they will just hit and slide into occlusion. Now, what happens there, if you go ahead and process that, you're going to say, oh my gosh, I've got a ton of grinding to do. So always look for that first point of contact. Now, if it's not there, make you a new bite registration. Make sure you get it almost at that first point of contact. Now, one thing I tell people, when you're figuring up your fee for your denture, include the cost of a remake. Include the remake. I'm trying to make you a lot of money here. Include the cost of a reset. Why? Because you're going to have to do them from time to time. You know, I think back about my granddad's 1961 Chevrolet pickup. You remember those old trucks? Had a steering wheel about this big. Of course, I was a lot smaller too. But the key thing with that was I would have to turn it about half the way around before it even started turning the wheels. Well, you know, a lot of people have a lot of play in these joints. A lot of times it's hard to get them in that repeatable position. So a reset is definitely within the realm of possibility. Now, hey, Chris, what do you charge for a reset?
Nothing for the first reset.
Nothing for the first reset. Can't you make them a better deal? What do you charge? What if they do a second reset?
Second reset is $26.
$26. Okay. Well, you know what I'm saying is, why don't you plan on $26? You know, adding that to every case just to cover a reset. You might not do it, but over the course of the year, all this is going to equal out. You know, and you won't mind doing it because you've got your lab bill paid for. So don't hesitate to make a new bite. I mean, sometimes we look at that and we think, okay, well, you know, it might not be that much. If it's just a minor hit and slide, yeah, you can probably adjust that out. But I'm telling you, if that first point of contact's up there and they're sliding quite a bit, don't process at that point. That's just going to be a frustrating situation for you. But now, as we're doing this, we need to go through our checks, the same checks we did with our wax rim. We're just doing it again with teeth. So here the patient is going through the F and V sounds, 55, 55, making sure that those incisal edges hit that wet-dry line when she's speaking. 66, count from 1 to 10 pretty quickly. When they're in the S sounds, that should be the closest speaking space. That's as close as the teeth come together without touching. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Have them go through that. Check the plane. As you go from commissure to commissure, that first premolar and canine should be about at that plane. Once again, if there's somebody significant in their life, make sure they take a look at the wax try-in also. Get that picked out. Now, how many of you mark your own post-palatal seals? Couple? Okay, and that's fine. But you know, you need to kind of know this because from time to time somebody might come in and you might need to check something there. Let me show you how to do that real quick. Just get you a mirror, put it on the ridge, and run it back. It'll fall right into the hamular notch. Now, I've got a good situation here because I've got a good ridge. Not every ridge is that well developed. Some of them are non-existent, it seems like. But I'm going to tell you, if you get that mirror and run it back, it'll still fall into that hamular notch. So you can see this is falling in. That's going to be the distal extent of the denture in that area. Now, here's the patient at rest. You see the palate here. So we know where this is, we know where this is. Obviously, we've got to fill in the space here. What you need to do is pinch their nose. Not real hard. You know, just occlude it and have them blow through it. Look at what happens to the palate. See all the muscles going nuts here? So when you compare these two, this is the patient at rest, and what you've got, unfortunately, is a little shadow, but basically what you've got is a junction here. And that junction is the vibrating line, okay? That's the distal extent of your denture. Now, you can get you a Thompson stick and go in and mark that. And what I did here, I just wanted to check and make sure that the lab put the denture, the post-palatal seal where I wanted it. Of course, another thing to do, get you an Explorer and make sure that we've got good displaceable tissue in there. But as you see, I put the denture back in, and that's right on line as to where they put it. So that's a way to check. From time to time, this might come in handy. It's a good thing to know. See that there. Okay, let's look at delivery. The first thing to do before you deliver a case, get you a 2x2 and wipe on the inside of the denture. Make sure there's no nodules left over. There shouldn't be, but for 2 seconds, it doesn't take any time or effort. Make sure if they're there, buzz them out of there. You sure don't want to try it in with that. Has anybody ever tried this aerosol pressure indicating paste? I tell you, I love this stuff. I love this stuff. Why? Because I hate that paste in the tub. You know, it's called Hydent, H-Y-D-E-N-T. Try that out. Try that out. Look at, I mean, this thing, just look how nice and even it sprays in there. I mean, from not having to get the old Q-tips out and the little paint brushes and painting the parallel lines and all this stuff, this works a lot better. Works a lot better. Now, if the patient's real dry, just make sure you add a little moisture to that, because what happens to pressure indicating paste in a real dry mouth? It can peel out. Give you something that looks like they need adjusting when they don't necessarily need it. So you go in, put pressure in the premolar, molar area, tug and check the labial frenum, buccal frenum, work it forward and back, and you can see right here there was a little area that needed adjusting. That's very common. Seems like on the distal buccal on the upper. Now, I know that this denture was packed and processed. I know Chris is using the Ivacap system, which has even less shrinkage. And I think I always have to do this on a packed and processed denture. You might not have to with one of the Ivacap dentures because there's not as much shrinkage. But what you see here, this area I think might have just pulled off a bit. I'm going to spray a little paste on there and try it again. This area looks like that was just maybe rubbed a little with seating. This in the frenum, yeah, I'm going to adjust that because I was working that frenum pretty good while I was checking this. So you just go through that process. Do the same thing with the lower. What you want to do is get the patient to stick their tongue in their right cheek, over into the left cheek, have them stick it up top, and stick it out and lick inside the lower lip. By going through all these tongue movements, you've actually checked from the distal lingual on the right side all through the lingual to the distal lingual on the left side. You've checked the full extension of your denture right there. Now, we want to go in and make sure that it's not lifting anywhere, that we don't have any gaps, that we've got filled what we need, adjust once again as needed. Once you've gone through this and gone through these motions and you don't see any areas wiping off, you're good to go. Of course, here's the key. Here's the key, the occlusion to our denture. A couple of weeks ago, I was at the Hinman Dental meeting down in Atlanta. That's the South's version of the Chicago Midwinter, I guess, up here, the biggest meeting in the area. I heard 3 denture lectures by 2 different people while I was down there. And one guy brought up an interesting point. I never really thought about it much this way. But he said, hey, I tell you what, if I had a fair impression to work off of and perfect occlusion, or if I had a perfect impression and fair occlusion, which one do you think I'd want to go with? Well, you think about it. He said, I want to go with the perfect occlusion. Y'all, I'm going to tell you, you have more denture issues that are occlusion related than you really realize. So always check that over real well. Why is that? Because you think about it, some of that occlusion can introduce horizontal forces, okay? If someone is coming in and they've got a sore spot right on top of the ridge, do you need to get the pressure indicating paste out and see where that sore spot is? No, because I'm going to tell you that sore spot right on top of the ridge is most likely due to occlusion. So check the bite first. Check the bite first. But what we need to do is have the patient biting evenly on both sides, hitting simultaneously. What we've got here, basically, functional or stamped cusp. Did y'all use those terms in dental school? Stamp or functional? And so forth. That's the lingual cusp of the upper, buccal cusp of the lower. Now the thing is, as you think about it, we really don't want to be adjusting these cusp tips. The only time you'd really adjust that cusp tip is if it's high in centric and all the excursions. What you really want to do is look at adjusting your marginal ridges and your fossa. Because once again, we want those forces directed perpendicular to the ridge, a more favorable situation. So what we've got here, we want posterior contacts hitting at the same time, both sides. You can have anterior contacts, but they need to be a little lighter. But most of our contacts, obviously, in the posterior. Now, the problem is we don't chew like dogs, do we? Dogs just come straight up and down. I told a buddy of mine once, I said, I wish all I did was make dentures for dogs. They'd still eat anything they wanted to, and they'd always come back with their tail wagging. Life's not that kind to us with our human patients. But the fact is, we've got some movement that we have to deal with. Okay, so if you think about it, remember this, bull, B-U-L-L, buccal upper, lingual lower. So when we're going into a working movement, what we're looking at doing here is we will adjust the lingual surface of our buccal cusp on the upper or the buccal surface of our lingual cusp. As you can see, this doesn't require any adjustment, but if we're going to adjust any here, I would rather adjust this non-functional cusp, obviously, than the functional cusp, okay? Because this is what preserves our vertical. Now, obviously, we've got a balancing side. A little trickier on the balancing side. What we're adjusting there is functional cusp against functional cusp. What you want to do is try to preserve as much of the cusp tip as you can, and so forth. Now, I think this is one of the keys in dentures, is protrusive. Because as the patient goes into protrusive, if there's any adjusting, it's going to be the distal inclines of the maxillary cusp or the mesial inclines of the mandibular cusp. Now, why is that critical? Well, I'm going to tell you. Because what do people do? They bite into things. That's how they function. You've got to make sure that these centrals come together and mesh real well. One of the most common complaints that I got from patients in their old dentures was, I do real well except when I eat salad. I can't get through lettuce. It just seems to pull through because those centrals don't mesh real well. So always check that. Now, I'm not going to say give them a salad when you deliver the denture, but still, if they can get through lettuce, I found generally they're pretty happy. Okay, so that's the during section. Let's move on to after. Here we're going to look at instructions, adjustments, and complications. Tennis great Arthur Ashe once said, one important key to success is self-confidence. And an important key to self-confidence is preparation. So that's what we're doing here today, and that's what we do in dentistry. We prepare to be successful. Because you think about it, on any of these big prosthetic cases, one of the hardest things to do is finish it out, because then you got to live with it. So let's prepare to be successful. And to do that, we need to know how to handle the case once we've delivered it. Well, first off, we need to come up with some instructions. It'd be nice if we had an owner's manual for our denture. Most of us don't. Most of us don't. I don't suggest you write one. But there are a few instructions that the patient can benefit from. The first off, and I'm assuming that we're dealing with a patient who's never worn dentures here before, okay? But tell the patient, when you eat, get small bites of food and put it on both sides of your mouth. Balance things out. Because if you think, when you're eating now, we normally eat everything on one side, don't we? We might switch it to the other side, but we're not dealing with a natural tooth situation. This is a denture. Try to balance it out. The problem is, down south, a lot of times I might make a denture on Billy Bob. And he'll tell me, yep, I'm going to go check this thing out tonight. I'm going to go eat me a steak. Don't do that, Billy Bob, please. You go let your wife have the steak. Why don't you eat some mashed potatoes, okay? Tell your patients to start with easier foods. And once they master that, move up in aggression. But don't start with a steak right off the bat. And one thing about biting again, and I learned this from a patient who had learned it from a dentist in Iowa years and years ago. And the dentist told him, he said, what you need to do is bite and push. He said, the reason is because you think about it. When we bite now, a lot of times we'll bite and pull. We've got our natural teeth, right? Well, if you've got dentures and you bite and pull, what does it do? It unseats your denture. But if you teach the patient to bite and push, now I'm not talking real hard, but they bite and push, what does that do to your denture? It seats it. It makes sense. Just a little biomechanics there. Another thing they need to do, tell them to read out loud. Because we've changed the contours in their mouth. You think about a kid when he first gets a retainer. Words are a little off. Doesn't take them long to adapt. But reading out loud will speed that along. Don't suggest it in the mall or on the street corners, but for the most part, if they'll do it at home, they'll get by. And something else. Boy, if they've never worn a denture, who opened the floodgates? A lot of times that will just stimulate those salivary glands and they might go nuts for a few days. Tell them this. Let them know it can happen. Now, after about 3 days, generally this is going to work its way out. But they might be floating for a bit, because basically you've introduced a foreign object in their mouth. And the thing they need to realize is that we're not building on a solid foundation here. The denture might fit differently at 6 o'clock in the morning as it does 6 o'clock at night because of the amount of fluid in the tissue. So just let them know, look, this might not feel exactly the same all day, every day. The fact of the matter is, the patient does need to take it out for a bit. Best thing to do is take it out at night. Let's make sure we keep it hydrated. A denture can actually warp if it's dried out. I tell the patients that so they'll keep it hydrated. Usually that'll take a couple of weeks, but for the most part, they don't need to know that. Just make sure you keep it hydrated and so forth. But you think about it. Think back about Dr. Svensson, the way he would talk about getting someone to take the denture out at night. He'd say, you've been wearing that denture all day, and you keep it in at night. He said, do you wear your socks all day and then sleep in them? No. But that's what we need. If we want healthy tissues, it's sure best to keep that out at night. And some pretty practical advice. What do a lot of our elderly patients do with the denture? They drop it. When the denture and the tile floor meet, who usually wins? The tile floor. Okay? So one thing I tell people is let's put some water in a sink. Get you a denture brush and brush it over the sink. If the denture hits that water, it will sink, but it's not going to break. And the one thing they all think, well, I use toothpaste in my mouth. Can I use that on my denture? No. No. I mean, I've seen patients who use toothpaste and actually develop some class 5 lesions in their denture, because they brushed it so much. And so, wow. Don't do that. Just really some liquid detergent with that denture brush will do fine in most cases. Now, if they're having trouble with some tartar buildup, calculus buildup, and so forth, just tell them to go to the pantry. Get some white vinegar. Tell them to throw that in there once a week. Let it soak overnight. That'll soften that tartar up in most cases where you can get a denture brush and just brush it off. If it won't, they might need to come in and let you grind it off, because it might be on there for good. But one of the key points, I tell people, if you've got a sore spot, don't let it heal up before you come in. Because the things I can see, I can help you with so much better. So make sure that you come in and don't sit around. And if you think it's going to be somebody who's going to have a lot of trouble with sore spots, just go ahead and schedule them to come in for a couple of checks. Because the worst thing that can happen is for them to sit at home and think about how bad everything is. Because by the time they get to you, it's really bad. When actually it can be taken care of pretty easily. But from time to time, we have to do some adjustments. You see here, this is a little irritated area, and obviously we've got a sore spot right here. Now, I ran my finger over this. She never felt it. That's healing. I'm not going to do anything to that. This area, pretty tender. In a situation like that, I still like to use those Thompson sticks. I mean, they're easy. You can circle the lesion. It doesn't transfer over real pretty, but I tell you, I know right now that's the area that's tender. I adjust it a little. You put it back in the mouth, and I swear 95% of the time, if I've adjusted that enough that they can tell I've made a difference, I just stop right there because they're going to be fine. Try it for a couple of days. If it's not better in a couple of days, holler back at me. Of course, you can use pressure indicating paste also. But sometimes we have these mystery sore spots. You can't really see them, but the patient's complaining. It doesn't really make sense. This is something else Dr. Svensson taught me. First off, get you some pressure indicating paste. Spray on the lower. Let's say we're dealing with a sore spot on the lower. Then get you a cotton roll and make you a couple of cotton balls, wet it just a little bit, and put one on each molar. Have the patient go through about 7 or 8 chews. Don't do any more, just about 7 or 8. Take a look at your pressure indicating paste at that point. A lot of times that will show you something that just finger pressure won't by itself. Now the thing is, you go more than 7 or 8 chews, it's probably going to displace too much. But just keep that in your bag of tricks, because every once in a while, thank goodness it doesn't happen often, but every once in a while you're going to have these mystery sore spots that aren't necessarily visible, but they're incredibly painful. This is one way to help them. And of course, if you don't have any of these little burrs, polishing burrs that you can, or polishing points that you can use in your slow speed handpiece, get you some. I mean, this is the coarse, the medium, and the high shine. Don't take that back to the lab. You can polish it up and be in and out a lot quicker. Okay, so let's look at a few complications here. The key thing with the denture complications is that really it's not that sophisticated, because what we're doing, we're either looking at adding something to the denture because we're deficient, or taking something away because we've got too much. And that's basically it. That's basically it. Sometimes, and boy, I hate to admit this, I've had this happen at times, sometimes we have a lack of retention right at insertion. Have you ever put a denture in that seemed to beat your hand out of the mouth? That's kind of embarrassing, isn't it? But it happens. It happens. Of course, one of the key things to do there is get a cotton roll, put it on each side. Have the patient bite down for about 5 minutes. Go do a hygiene check. Run down to Sonic. Do you have Sonic in Wisconsin? Okay, run down to Sonic. Do what you need to. Come back in 5 and see how the retention is then. In most cases, it'll be a little better. And you think about it, can you say that the day you're delivering the denture, that tissue is in exactly the same spot it was the day you made your impression? Wow, we were talking about a while ago about fluid changes within the day. And we're talking about maybe a month difference. Yeah, that can be different. So see if this helps. If the patient's better, just reassure them, hey, go try this. Things just need to settle. If it's not any better, still beating your hand out of the mouth after about 5 minutes, you might have to consider a reline or something along those lines. But in most cases, that's going to help. So let's look at the maxillary arch. One of the big issues we run into sometimes is an incorrect postpalatal seal. And as you see here, the problem is this is an old denture. It's amazing that the patient's been able to wear it, but that's the posterior extension of the denture that mirrors in the hamular notch. Now, it's amazing to me what some people have gotten by with for years. Let's say this thing doesn't have the retention that we need. I mean, take a look at this. We mark it with a Thompson stick, put that back in the mouth, and check it. I mean, we're 3 millimeters short. One way to do this, like I said, basically we're looking at addition or subtraction. So obviously here we need a little bit more. What I'm going to do, and oh gosh, I even hate to bring compound out, okay, but it does work pretty well for this, or you can use a heavy body impression material possibly. But get a little compound and add it in the area that you're deficient. Take it back to the mouth. If that improves retention, then let's look at getting this extended. Maybe with a little reline impression using the compound, send it to the lab, and extend it properly. Of course, this is a little unusual here. Don't run into this too often, and thank goodness we don't. But you can look up here, actually dealing with the outside of the denture. Thank goodness we don't run into this a lot. But what you've got there is a situation where the patient kind of opens, moves their mouth around, and it loosens the denture up. So what you need to do is get you some pressure indicating paste and put on the outside of the denture, have the patient move the jaw from side to side, because what you're checking here is to see if the coronoid process is coming over and hitting that and loosening it up. I haven't run into that too often, but I have run into it from time to time. So if it is, you're going to be adjusting the outside of the denture, just like you would the inside. If the patient comes in and they're smiling and the denture falls out, most likely what you're dealing with there is a short denture. Get your compound, extend up in here, see if that helps create a better seal. Another issue where the patient's opening and the denture loosens. You remember a while ago, I told you to make sure that you have the patient yawn real big, open real big when you're making the impression. See what happens to the ligament back here? Boy, that thing can tighten up on some of those big yawns. So that can actually kick a denture loose if you haven't compensated for that in some patients. So if it's getting loose, remember you might have to get a little pressure indicating paste in the hamular notch, hold it in, have them yawn, and see if it's wiping off there. If it is, hollow it out just a little bit. And of course, sometimes we have air escape. Where we're whistling. Generally, if we're whistling on the S sounds, there's a few different things that can be the problem. Your anterior teeth might be placed too far facial. Your posterior teeth might be placed too palatal. And whatever it is, it's constricting the tongue to a degree that deepens the medial groove and allows air to escape. We might not have enough acrylic in this area. So one way you can check that, one simple way, is that you can get you some alginate powder. Sprinkle it on this side of the denture, take it to the mouth, have the patient count from 1 to 6, whatever. Where you see the wet spots where the tongue is touching the alginate, you know it's sealing. Where you see an area, let's say right here, that's dry, you know the air is getting out there. So what you can do, you can go in and look at adding wax in this area to see if it creates a little bit better seal. Or if that's not working, you can look at maybe thinning the denture out in the palate here. Either way, we're trying to stop that whistling S sound. Sometimes you run into a situation where the S kind of sounds like an SH, a slurry SH. If that's the case, it's lateral air escape. It's just the opposite. What you might want to do is add in the posterior and maybe take away in the anterior. If the patient comes in, upper lip tingling, maybe up into the nose, reddened, swollen, incisive papilla. Get you a little pressure indicating paste, give it a little bit more room, and so forth. Mandibular arch. Not that we ever having trouble on the mandibular arch, but let's look at a few things there. Of course, the key thing would be the overextension. And what you do here is if you think it might be overextended any on the buccal, you just have the patient put the tongue forward, put your hand on the denture, and tug on the lips and the cheek. Just go all the way around. If there's any area that you have lift, that's where you're overextended. Pressure indicating paste, do it again, and adjust until you're not lifting there. Now, if we're working on the lingual, you just go through all those tongue movements we did when we were checking. Right and left cheek, stick it up top, lick inside the lower lip. Right and left cheek is going to get you about at the molar region. Stick it up top, it's going to get the lingual frenum, the anterior. Lick inside the lower lip, that's your distal lingual. So if you think you're having problems there, go through those movements. You know, another thing you can do pretty quick if you're cautious about a overextension on the buccal, you fill the mandible and go up. Your denture should not be out wider than your mandible. So that's a quick way to check. We might have some numbness or tingling in the lower lip. Obviously, in a situation like this, we're thinking the mental nerve's an issue. Get down there with your fingers, rub in there, see if you can duplicate those symptoms. If you can, mark it, adjust it, and go to town. Sometimes we have things that affect both arches, like a dry mouth. This can be due to medicine, alcoholism, disease, radiation. Any of those can be a factor. If that's the case, we might have to utilize a salivary substitute. Cheek biting. Another issue. From time to time you'll run into this. We would like to have 2 millimeters overlap, horizontal overlap. What that does, that holds the cheek out as we go through the chewing cycle. If we're biting our cheek over here, what you want to do is take in the buccal of the lower cusp. Obviously, not getting into the functional cusp. If you're in a cross bite, it's going to be just the opposite. You'd take in the buccal of the upper cusp. Okay? The other cheek biting issue is sometimes if these areas are too close back here, they're going to pinch that buccal fat pad. You'd like to make sure that you've got 3 millimeters of space there. If you don't, get you 3 to 4. If not, you're going to be liable to pinch that pretty well. And of course, some people end up gagging with a new denture. Gagging with that denture is generally due to either the denture being too long or the denture being too thick. Now, we always think of long, but thickness can be an issue also. So it's no problem to shorten this. We can make a line where a vibrating line is, transfer that to the denture and shorten it as is. Okay. But if there's a ridge back here, boy, that will drive some patients crazy. In other words, if the denture sits off the tissue too much. So just kind of feather it into the tissue. You can thin that down to where it's about 1.5 millimeters, and it'll be fine. But make sure it just kind of tapers into the tissue and doesn't create a ridge. The same thing can be said for the distal lingual. If this area is too long, shorten it. Now, once again, how do you check this area? Stick the tongue out, lick inside the lower lip. If it's too thick, thin it down to about 1.5 millimeters. That should take care of a lot of the gagging issues. Of course, you can also have them maybe get some, sweet and sour candy, some of that hard candy, and just suck on that. A lot of times that'll help with a gagger. The fact is, though, when we're dealing with these dentures, one of the main problems we have is patients have trouble controlling them. Like we talked about, the upper denture has good retention for the most part. But the fact of the matter is, just like I mentioned a while ago, the tongue and the cheek muscles have a lot to do with holding that lower denture in. And some people just have a little bit better neuromuscular control than others. Now, I know y'all have been looking at me up here and you're thinking, he's probably one of the better athletes to ever come out of Arkansas. He looks big, tall, strong, fast. Y'all, I wasn't, but I appreciate the thought. The fact is, if Michael Jordan and I get out on the basketball court and we're playing horse, because I'm not going to play him one-on-one. But if we're playing horse, he's going to beat me every time because his neuromuscular control as far as basketball is much better than mine. Well, if you think about it, that's just a coordination issue. And we're talking about tongue and cheek muscle control. Is that not the same in the mouth? Why couldn't it be? I swear, I think there are some people that you could put a couple of Tupperware lids in their mouth and they'd chew anything they wanted to. Not that we really tried that, you know. But have you ever seen what I call the ridge runners, where it seems like it's just teeth with enough acrylic to hold it together, and the patient says, yeah, I can eat anything I want to. Is that because that denture's made so well? I don't think so. I don't think so. That's because the patient has some incredible tongue and cheek muscle control. Some of them are blessed with it. Some of them aren't. So that's the after. That's what we do to try to make sure that the patients are functioning satisfactorily after we finish the case. Okay. In conclusion, I'd like to talk today about what we've done and also discuss where we're going. When I started today, I gave you my outline. It was the before, during, and after of the denture process. In before, we talked about evaluating the patient, doing the examination, seeing how many things were stacked in your corner for success. And the ultimate decision you have to make is this case worth doing? Is this patient worth putting up with? Can I charge enough to smile every time they come in? Those are the issues. Then we looked at the actual denture process, the during. I didn't save you a whole lot of time, but we cut down from a 5-appointment sequence to a 4-appointment sequence. You know, if you're looking for something, if you're having some struggles with your denture impressions, consider something like the AccuDent system. And this is where we fall back once again on the words of John Wooden to pay attention to those details. You know, Wooden didn't say that he would guarantee success. He said they usually accompany success. Because I'm going to tell you, when it came down to dentures, y'all, I never guaranteed my dentures. I never guaranteed my dentures. The one thing I did guarantee my patients is I said, look, I can guarantee you you'll get my best efforts. But there are too many factors here beyond my control. But you'll get the best I can do. And if they could accept that, I went with it. If they couldn't, and to be honest with you, I never had anybody who said I can't handle that. So keep that in mind. But take the words of Greg Foles also and do common things uncommonly well. That attention to detail will help tremendously. And then we talked about the after effects. You know, you think about it, very rarely do our patients present us with a perfect ridge. And you know, when you get down to it, our materials aren't necessarily perfect. Think of expansion, contraction, bonding issues. It's not a perfect situation. And I've got to admit that my techniques aren't perfect. So as we go through this whole process, we're going to have things that don't end up perfect. So you got to know how to deal with that. And basically what you're looking at is simple addition or subtraction, one of those two. So that's what we've done. Okay, what's our next step? Where do we go from here? Well, here at the lab, we're committed to your success with complete dentures. And we'd like to follow up this program to make sure that we all get off on the right foot. I don't know if Scott's in here or not, but Scott's got a sign-up sheet. And here's what I want you to do. As you leave today, stop by and see Scott and sign up for a lunch and learn at your office. Now, Joe, let me ask you, how much did you pay to come here today?
I didn't pay anything.
Didn't pay anything. That's a pretty good deal, even to hear me speak. Okay, that's a pretty good deal.
Excellent.
You've got a meal today. We've got a lunch and learn for you. What's the first word there? Lunch. That's another meal, okay? At the lunch and learn, Scott's going to come to the office. And he's going to go over some tidbits, mainly focusing in on the impression appointment and the records appointment. We've got a denture kit for you. This kit's provided by Ivoclar. It's a $200 value. So think about this. For your time here, basically putting up with me, you get breakfast this morning, you're getting your hour's credit today. Sign up for the Lunch and Learn, you get another hour's credit and another meal. You're making money. Okay, it's a no-brainer. Now in this kit, there's a pupillometer, the allometer, a rim former, a fox plane, and a shade guide. Basically a lot of the stuff you're going to need for your records appointment. The whole idea here is we're going to use this pupillometer and this allometer so that the lab can make you a rim that requires little or no adjusting. If any adjusting is needed, you've got your rim former. Adjust that maxillary rim to the proper contours for the aesthetics that you're wanting. Then go to the lower rim and establish that vertical. You've got you a vertimeter that you can use to measure the vertical dimension of rest. Subtract 3 millimeters. Get your vertical dimension of occlusion. Once you've made your bite, select your shade. You're good to go. I hope that you found and will find this presentation beneficial for your complete denture cases. And more importantly, I hope you find complete dentures driving your practice growth for years to come. You know, thinking back to the Renaissance, it was a time of reconnecting to some classical sources and advancing that knowledge. Now you think about it. In prosthetics, what's more classical than complete dentures? I mean, most of our prosthetic concepts came from complete dentures. And you know, we're not talking about a major expense to get involved if you're not doing many dentures. But what I want you to do is take these simple concepts, once again, to drive your practice growth. Okay, I love to tell stories. One last story. This is the house that my granddad grew up in. Actually was born in. He was born in 1906. No one lives here now, obviously. So it's well over 100 years old. When my granddad graduated school, he went to St. Louis and went to work for the Federal Reserve Bank. While he was there, he called up one of his childhood friends and said, "Hey, can you get me tickets to a Cardinal game?" The guy said, "Sure, I'll get you tickets. Come on down." So he and my grandmother go to the game. They're sitting in the box, and the friend comes up to visit with them. The friend is future Hall of Fame inductee Dizzy Dean. While they were talking there, Dizzy Dean told my granddad, he said, "Babe," that was his nickname for Babe Ruth. He said, "Babe, when we were kids, I always wanted to be as good a ball player as you." That's pretty neat. Okay, now I'm going to get Paul Harvey on you and tell you the rest of the story. Let's go inside that house. This is the fireplace. Obviously, it's probably changed over 100 years, but that's where it originally was. When my granddad was a youngster, he and his brother were wrestling one day. He fell into the fire. Severely burned his right arm. It never completely developed. So my granddad learned to play baseball with one arm. With the peg of the arm, he could hold the glove, he could throw, slip his hand in, field. That's how he learned to play. You know, the important point here is in a lot of areas in life you have setbacks, but don't let that frustrate you. Keep moving ahead. Do like my granddad did. You know, as a youngster, he could have said, "Hey, I've only got one arm. I don't need to be playing baseball." But you know, he stuck with it and actually ended up being able to tell me a story that I'll pass on to my kids. And you know, the dentures are the same way. If you haven't had a denture setback, you haven't done enough dentures. Because once again, we're not doing dentures for dogs. But that's just part of it. So if you've been shying away, I'd encourage you to get involved. Because as we get back to the Renaissance, Michelangelo once said, the greatest danger for most of us lies not in setting our aim too high and falling short, but in setting our aim too low and achieving our mark. Y'all, I want you to set your aim high. I want you to grow your practice and realize your dreams. That, my friends, is where we're going. Thank you for joining me today for the Removable Renaissance. I appreciate your kind attention. Listen, I'm going to open the time up for questions. If anybody has any, if you need to go, don't feel like you got to stick around. But I'll be here as long as anybody wants to talk, and we can talk dentures. But once again, I sure appreciate it, and you guys have a great weekend. Thank you so much.